There's nothing wrong with you, but there is something that you're not seeing. There's a point in most people's lives where they start to realize something, and it's not in a dramatic way, not in a moment of collapse, but in a series of small internal recognitions that build over time. Things are functioning, life is moving, and on the outside things often look relatively put together. And yet internally there's this sense that something isn't fully being seen. And it's not by other people, it's by you. And I want to be very precise from the start here. This isn't about something being wrong. It's not about fixing yourself. It's not about adding more information. In most cases, you already have enough understanding. You can explain yourself very well. You can describe patterns, tendencies, and reactions. You can probably even map out where certain behaviours come from. And yet, despite that clarity, the actual lived experience doesn't always shift. And that's usually where confusion begins, because the assumption is that understanding should equal change. But internally, that's not how the system operates, because what you're dealing with here is not a lack of insight. It's a lack of real-time visibility, and there is a big difference. Insight is retrospective. It explains what has already happened, but most patterns that shape your life don't announce themselves after the fact. They happen in the moment, before thought even fully forms, before reaction is possible. And that means something very significant. You can understand yourself perfectly well and still miss the moment where patterns actually activate. Not because you're unaware, but because it's happening faster than awareness usually arrives. And this is where things start to become very interesting, because most cases of what we call personality is actually automatic sequencing. A set of responses that get triggered by specific conditions. They're not chosen, they're not deliberate, they're just learned through repetition. And over time, those responses become so familiar that they feel like your identity. But they are not identity in the way that people usually think. They are patterns of prediction. Your system learns that when this happens, I respond like this. And that response becomes efficient and reliable and predictable, which is exactly what the nervous system wants. But it's not the truth, it's not freedom, and it's not predictability. And this is where something very subtle starts to happen, because once your system becomes efficient at predicting and responding in certain ways, it starts to reduce variability. There is less spontaneity, less deviation, less unpredictability in emotion or behavioural responses. And that can feel like stability from the inside, but over time it can start to feel like constriction, a narrowing of your range, not externally but internally. And most people don't notice this directly. They notice the effects. They notice that they respond in the same way in similar situations, that certain emotions start to feel familiar even when they're not helpful. That reactions seem to arrive before there's even time to choose something different. And then the mind steps in afterwards to explain it, to make sense of it, to build a narrative around it. But the narrative always comes second. The system always moves first. And I want to be clear here, this isn't about trying to eliminate patterns. That wouldn't make sense at all. Patterns are how you function. They are what allow you to operate without constantly having to decide everything. The issue is not that they exist. The issue is when they operate without being seen in real time. Because when something is unseen in the moment it happens, you can't fully relate to it as something flexible. It just feels like me. And that's where things get locked in. And there's another layer here that we'll look at quickly, because over time, especially in high-functioning people, awareness itself can become slightly externalized, meaning you become very good at observing yourself after the fact. You reflect, you analyze, you process, you journal, and all of that creates a sense of understanding. But it doesn't necessarily change the moment the pattern is occurring. So you end up with a kind of split. You have high levels of insight but limited interpretation, understanding without success and clarity without real-time change. And that is often where frustration starts to build, because from your perspective, you're doing the work. You're aware, you're reflective, you're engaged with yourself. but the lived experience still repeats certain structures. And this isn't a problem to solve in the traditional sense. It's more of a shift from what you're actually paying attention to. Because most change processes focus on content, things like what you think about, what you feel, what you understand. But the deeper layer is process. How the system is actually generating those thoughts and reactions in the time that they're happening. And until that becomes visible, nothing really changes at the level that people expect it to. And I want to leave you here with something quite simple, because this is usually where things start to open up. Not where you try to become different, but when you start noticing the moment that something becomes familiar again. That subtle shift from presence to pattern, from experience into repetition. That moment is everything, because that's where the system is actually visible, not afterwards but during. And this is also very important because none of what I've spoken about here is about becoming somebody different. It's about regaining access to what was already there before the system learned to organize itself in the way it has. It's not a new identity, but a less constrained one. If this resonated and you want to go deeper into how these patterns form in real time and what actually needs to shift underneath them, click the link underneath this video. That's where I break it down in more detail and show you how to work directly with the system rather than just observing it from a distance.